Today we'll be talking about truth, fact, and confirmation. So the outline for this module is very simple. It's all going to be about analyzing evidence, and we're going to do that by breaking things down just a bit. We're going to look at theories of truth. We're going to look at facts, the notion of a fact. So when you're in a conversation and you say something and you can back it up by saying, and that's a fact, usually people respond in a different way than if you say, and that's my opinion. Now, the question is there really an elevated status to a fact? Third, confirmation and disconfirmation. We're going to end with these two, and we're going to continue with the notion of confirmation, corroboration, and falsification in the following weeks. These are very interesting and very foundational concepts in philosophy of science as well as the sciences. One really simple note is that a lot of times people say, you've proved something. So I've proved that something is correct. I've confirmed something. And we want to take a look at if this is the proper way to go about discussing scientific evidence, and if there's perhaps a more adequate way to express what evidence actually is in science. So we have a lot of intuitions about truth and facts. For example, we do think that a lot of times we get more facts with more scientific practice. Think about the amount of data that we have. So we look at the world in terms of data and algorithms. Our current scientific worldview is turning into that we can break things down and analyze every aspect of those things. And I think what it mostly indicates is that we have a very high ambition that we can successfully analyze data. So we keep on storing more so that we can one day hopefully successfully analyze that data. But it's not only that we have a large amount of data, we also have data on many levels. Now I'd like to show you a simulation that I think is a very cool one. It demonstrates just the amount of data that we have on many different kinds of levels. So here's a simulation someone created to show us the scale of the universe. And this shows you a side-by-side comparison of all of the systems that we actually have data on, we have information about. And what you'll see is that we have information about systems on a very tiny scale, so it zooms in all the way to past genetic information, keeps on zooming in, wavelengths of light. All the way down to quarks, and even further to superstrings and quantum foam, things that, as we'll talk about later, might be mathematical constructs. And we can go all the way back up. And I just want you to notice how much information we have about things on many different levels. All the way past where we were. And we get past planets. Galaxies. And this is where things get really cool. The observable universe. I just want you to take a second to ponder that, and perhaps we can put on some music to help you ponder this. And just zoom back in really quickly. These are all of the things that we have data on, all of the things that we understand the systems and the information, at least to an approximate degree. Anyway, that occasionally blows my mind. So away from the interstellar stuff and back to the pragmatic, the amount of data that we have on many different levels is absolutely astounding. And I want you to consider this. All of these things that I've just pointed out to you, for example, are they facts or are they just representations? And when we talked about the nature of representations, which is something that is foundational for us, these things, representations, are only accurate in aspects and degrees. They're distorted, they misrepresent, they give us a limited view of what things look like from a vantage point. So we have other intuitions. For example, what makes a belief true? Well, you might say that it's a fact. But then, what is a fact? Well, you might think a true belief. We have certain circles within our reasoning that we might have to get out of. Now, as we'll see later on, is that maybe we shouldn't use facts to define things, and perhaps we should maybe even take out the term fact and substitute it with something a little bit more practical. We have other intuitions. For example, we're very critical about what is presented as truth. Some people take it as an opportunity to be critical at all times. You'll be having a casual conversation with someone, and you'll just want to call them out for some facts. You say, actually, according to the study that I read, etc., etc. Now, this is something that is very socially unpleasant, but I think that we do have a culture of calling people out for falsehoods. But sometimes we don't. Sometimes we take things for granted. So sometimes we're presented with false appearances that we don't even know are false. And I'd like to give you an example of this that happens within the sciences. And this is one of the more interesting examples I've come across. So how critical are you of experts? Now think about what's going on currently in the debate about vaccination. What is your evolution like throughout this debate? Were you around when the data came out that vaccines had a correlation to autism? How did you react when this data was actually found out to be fully false? These are very interesting questions that I think are social questions, but they're closely tied to scientific practice. So here's another example. Dr. Staple was a very well-recognized social psychologist. Dr. Staple had 24 studies that were absolutely amazing studies, and I'm going to give you some examples in a little bit. But one interesting note about these studies is all of the data was completely made up by him. So here are some examples. He had really fascinating research questions like whether individuals are inclined to consume more when primed with the idea of capitalism. He found they in fact were. Whether trash-filled environments tended to bring out racist tendencies in individuals. So this is in places like near bus stops. He found they in fact did tend to bring out racist tendencies in individuals. The data was fully made up. So for the first study, where it talks about consumption, consumption was measured in terms of M&M consumption. And what Staple did, this is an anecdote for how he made up this data, he sat in his kitchen and ate M&Ms and filled out all of the questionnaires for the survey. And he said he tried to put himself into the position of those subjects. It is very fascinating how our society deals with people that are frauds. So sometimes they are shunned. Dr. Staple lost his position as the dean, but he got a book deal out of it. I think it's very interesting that when Staple was interviewed, he was very honest about why he did what he did. And the most fascinating aspect of the interview was this part right here. He called the truth messy, and specifically he said, it's hard to know the truth. And I like this analogy very much. When somebody says, I love you, and I think this is relevant for a certain day that's coming up, how do I know what it really means? And so this is kind of like a postmodern interpretation of the truth. How do you know what the truth really means? And so, if you falsify data, how do you know what it really means to falsify data? Now, clearly, this is a terrible standard to have. Why? Because if we were publishing things that were fully false and under the impression of being vaguely false or vaguely true, this would not be very good for scientific practice. But as we'll see later on in the semester, perhaps this is how science works. I think the interesting lesson here is sometimes what we take for granted as the truth, like all of Staple's studies, for example, is actually just a false appearance. And we really want to know what the truth is and what falsehood is so that we can differentiate the two. Because we definitely don't want to say that truth is something that's as fuzzy as something like this, for example. We don't want to say that subjective experiences of the truth transfer over to scientific truth as well. So perhaps we have falsehoods that are kind of like this. If you're a mesosome, I'm a mesosome. These things that we have in science that at one time we thought were true are at other times thought to be false. But we had better get a technical account of the truth so that we don't just say that it's fuzzy. So let's make the truth a little bit more technical. First, we can clarify the question. What makes true statements, true theories, and true beliefs true? So we have this intersecting philosophical discipline that we won't really talk too much about. It's epistemology, the study of knowledge. But it is very important in setting up certain issues in philosophy of science, and I think it's just a fabulous discipline. It asks questions like the following. How do we come to know which statements and beliefs are true? So here's a classic example. If I'm standing in front of you, in front of the classroom, and everyone in the classroom sneezes, and a fact about sneezing is actually that when you sneeze, you can't possibly keep your eyes open. So try that next time. When you sneeze, your eyes close automatically. So you're sitting in front of me in the classroom, you sneeze, your eyes close, and in that split second, I pick up a perfect replica cardboard cutout of myself and put it in front of me. And you look up and you can't differentiate that that's a cardboard cutout of me. So the question is, if you think to yourself, that's Vadim Kaiser standing in front of me, do you know that? Is that something that is knowledge? So these are the kinds of examples that you look at in epistemology. Some people think it's completely silly and impractical. Other people think it's actually very interesting. So is knowledge something like true justified belief, or is it something that is perhaps more? So we have epistemology as an intersecting discipline here, and we might use certain aspects from epistemology, but we won't talk too much about it. So we'll be talking about the correspondence theory of truth and the coherence theory of truth. So the correspondence theory of truth. We have observed correspondence before, the correspondence between perspective and phenomena. This is going to be a very similar relation. What makes a true belief or theory true is that it corresponds to reality. And what makes a false belief false is that it fails to correspond to reality. So in this case, take the belief it is raining outside. The reality is it, in fact, is raining. Or a theory, mesosomes are real cellular structure, and the reality, they are not real cellular structures. So you can see how the correspondence works or fails to work. Now, the term reality, in this case, is supposed to indicate objects, events, and processes which are independent of us. And we've seen this before, so we did talk about reality, but it was in the form of phenomena. So we use the term phenomena, or at least in von Frauen's sense, as objects, events, and processes that have certain properties which are independent of measurement. So here we're really talking about the same thing. The world that is independent of us, the world that is objective. So the big picture is we have to have some sort of matching between our beliefs and theories and the world. And if there's a mismatch, then there's a failure in correspondence. And that's what makes a false belief false or a false theory false. The coherence theory of truth is slightly different. We need not make any claims about the objective world. In fact, as we'll talk about in a second, it might be very difficult to have access to the objective world. So what makes a belief true, according to the coherence theory of truth, is that it coheres with other beliefs. Now I want you to think about the puzzle analogy that the reading discusses. When we have a puzzle, certain other puzzle pieces fit in and other ones don't. And what determines this is the kind of puzzle we're working on. So think about the reference class as determining the puzzle. So you might have a puzzle that you work on by yourself or with other people perhaps, or within the larger community. And this indicates what kind of coherence you're looking at. So here's a very simple example. Washing your hands will minimize your chances of getting a cold. So think about this in our current scientific paradigm. How we think about things in terms of bacteria and viruses. What our beliefs are about infection. Now, I want you to think about how unusual that is just for a second. We put our skin under running water to make sure that we feel healthy. But for us, that belief makes sense. Why? Because it fits in with the puzzle pieces that we have in modern medicine. So think about other very simple examples like the current diet trends that we have. So in the 90s, it was a very bad thing to eat saturated fats. At a certain point, it became very bad to eat red meat. And then it transferred over to carbohydrates. Now people are talking about the Paleolithic diet, where people just eat like we used to eat 40,000 years ago. Or we think about the current trends in probiotics diets. So things like kombucha and cultured milk products are becoming very big. At every single stage, we believe that our theories about diet are correct. And then we see at the later stages that they're completely wrong. So in fact, eating high amounts of cholesterol does not raise your cholesterol. We take a piece of information like that, and we're actually working with a new puzzle. So within the next 10, 20 years, diets will keep on changing, and the kinds of puzzles that we work on and the kinds of puzzle pieces that are relevant and fit in will also change. So let's talk about some problems, and let's start with the coherence theory of truth. And I think you're starting to see what the problem might be. Changing the reference class too much, changing the puzzles too much, is maybe not such a great thing. And the reason why is because there might be some relativism here. So what if our frame of reference contains some sort of bias? And here's a great example. A lot of the evidence on diets is actually based on, number one, studies with model organisms. So for example, mice. Or very small samples of the population, where you might get some sort of genetic bias or other environmental effects. And the third bit of evidence that's always something that you want to avoid is anecdotal evidence. If anyone is into current fitness trends, for example, things like P90X or CrossFit or other high-intensity programs, usually you get a diet that's associated with those programs. And you get a lot of evidence that is in support of those diets. Now the question is, how much of that evidence is something that is anecdotal? And the point about anecdotal evidence is that perhaps it is very biased. So the question is, how often does our frame of reference actually shift? And how often does this frame of reference have some sort of bias that's associated with it? If there's not that much bias and our frame of reference doesn't shift that often, then maybe we need not be concerned. But what I want to suggest is, sometimes we learn more by disagreement than we do by agreement. So for example, think about things like the following. The mesosome, eyewitness accounts, and differentiating mirages from actual things, hallucinations from real phenomena in the world. Sometimes we need contradictory pieces of information in order to understand that what we have in front of us is a falsehood rather than the truth. So we've discussed the mesosome many times over. When we compare different preparatory procedures, we see that the mesosome is a falsehood. But it's only when we compare a different frame of reference. Same thing with eyewitness accounts. We have to make sure that eyewitnesses do not interact and do not talk to each other, and that they're not questioned too much. Why? Because memory construction is something that happens if there's too much intersection between the eyewitnesses and other people that they're involved with. For example, the investigators as well as other eyewitnesses. So studies have shown that you can actually get people to reconstruct memories that they never had, like seeing a red car at a crime scene or something like that. So we want to maintain some sort of independence, and perhaps in contradictory eyewitness accounts we can learn more than if they all agreed and merged together. Same thing with mirages and hallucinations. In order to figure out if what you're seeing is a mirage or if you are currently under a hallucination, We have to figure out a way to get a different perspective involved or a different frame of reference. So perhaps what you can do is you can use your perceptual modes of measurement. You can try to not only look at the mirage, but also touch it. And if you touch it, that's an independent mode of measurement, and it's no longer there, then you know you are witnessing a mirage. So the punchline is, perhaps having coherence is not how we learn about the truth. Perhaps having contradictory pieces of information is actually a better approach. There are also problems for the correspondence theory of truth, and this one we've seen before. This is the major problem of representationalism or perspectivalism. We are stuck within our representations, and we cannot gain access to the real world or the phenomena. So if you recall from weeks 1 and 2, how is it that we can gain information about what things are actually like when all we have is information about what things look like from a certain vantage point? So here's a really simple demonstration that I found on Google. If you're taking a look at a cat with no nose and you see the cat, but how you're seeing it is the representation of the cat. And in fact, I want you to think about this for a second. Right now, you're not seeing a computer screen in front of you. Right now, you're not seeing your hands in front of you. Right now, you're not seeing this room that you're in front of you. All you're seeing is representations of those things as reconstructed by your brain. So in a very strange sense, we are trapped within our representations. And that might freak you out, or you might just think that that's kind of commonplace. I think that's just a very strange thought. We are forever trapped within our representations. Not only that, we don't have access to anyone else's representations. So not only do we have no access to direct reality, but we have no access to other representations. And also, maybe this is kind of a weird thought, we don't have access to our previous representations. All we ever have access to is our current representation within this moment. And that sucks. So let's move on. So according to the reading, the author really liked this example of total recall. And I don't know if you all remember this example. I mean, basically, this is the common theme that we have in movies and literature is, what if you don't know that you're being deceived? So in Total Recall, Arnold has false memories that are implanted in him, and he has to get to the truth. And it's kind of a very strange film. But we have other movies like The Matrix, Inception, where we don't know if we are under deception, false memories, false perceptions, and the illusion of reality. And the thing that's amazing about it is, and let me just get Arnold off the screen real quick. The thing that's amazing is that there's no way that we can ever step out. There's no way that we can ever assess the accuracy of any representation, because we can only ever compare it to other representations. So when we talk about a theory or a measurement or a perception or even something like a photograph, we can never assess the accuracy of that thing by putting it right next to reality and comparing the two. All we can ever do is just put photos side by side, data models side by side. Perceptions, that one's a kind of hard one to put side by side with other perceptions. But the point is, we're trapped within our representations. So I want you to note that just because we can't know if something is true does not mean that it isn't. This is an epistemic or an epistemological problem, that we can't know if something is true. But the metaphysical aspect of it, that it is in fact true. So for example, we have arrived at the truth by accident or perhaps by good methods, and we just don't know about it. These are two separate issues. So let's put in some concluding remarks about the truth. Both theories of truth run into epistemological or epistemic problems. How do we know if something is true? The problem with coherence is our frame of reference. The problem with correspondence is that we never gain access to reality. But this is not reason to drop these theories. In fact, I want you to think about, and if you do take epistemology in the future, I want you to think about if there's any way for us to develop theories that are independent of correspondence and coherence. Is there another way that human beings can think about the truth? And we definitely don't want to reduce the truth to mere opinion, because then people can walk around saying, this is true for me, it's not true for you. And then we'd have a very difficult time establishing guidelines within society as well as within scientific practice. So let's talk about facts now. As human beings, we arrive at conclusions in two ways. The first one is through direct observation and reasoning. The second one is through reasoning without observation. So I'm going to make it really simple for us. When we arrive at conclusions about matters of fact, and we do it through observing, this is a very simple activity. Is there a cat in front of the box? You don't have to get all fancy about this and say, well, maybe the box is in front of the cat. There's clearly a cat in front of a box, and we can see it. We've reasoned about it after observing it. Now think about it like this. What if we have a situation where we reason without observation? So I want you to think about this. What happens to the cat when it's inside the box? So imagine that this cat jumps into the box and the box closes and we can no longer see the cat. What happens to that cat? So I couldn't find a great representation of the box actually closing. The closest I could find is the cat jumping inside the box and then tipping over. We have to imagine that this cat successfully fit into this tiny box. What we assume is that when the box closes, the cat does not disappear. This is a very interesting assumption. The world exists even if we don't observe it. You close the computer screen and I still exist. You walk out of the room and the room still exists. And this itself is never based on observation. I love that. I think it's the coolest thing in the world. We've never observed what happens to the world when we don't observe it. But we have some sort of information about it that we've reasoned to without observation. So we reason to things that we have never directly observed. For example, what is going on within your digestive system? What is going on outside of your state? What is going on in the cosmos? This reasoning is based on some sort of background assumptions and or justifications. Now I'd like to slightly differentiate the two. The difference is more in our approach to analyzing things than it is in the nature of assumptions and justified beliefs. Both things can be questioned. In fact, assumptions may be completely wrong and should be questioned. But what's very interesting is that sometimes we have these hidden assumptions in scientific theories that we don't directly question. We assume them as foundational, and then we question other things that result from them. So for example, Newton's conception of space and time versus the relativity conception of space and time versus quantum mechanics versus superstring theory. We have certain things that are assumed perhaps, and then the framework is built upon those assumptions. Now, just because we don't question assumptions or foundational assumptions does not mean that we shouldn't question those assumptions. So think about, for example, a very simple assumption that we take in infection, how contamination works. That if you touch something pure to something that is contaminated, what is going to transfer over? The contamination transfers over to the purity side and not the other way around. Is this assumption true in all circumstances of infection? That's something that's an empirical issue, and that's something that might show the assumption to either be true or false. So here's a great example of when we reason without direct observation. So Darwin reasoned about the tree of life, and in fact this is a sketch of the tree of life from 1837. This is Darwin's first sketch of the tree of life. And it's important to notice that as brilliant as Darwin was and as amazing as his hundreds of pages of writing and observation about nature were, he had a lot of things that were wrong within those observations. Another thing that he got wrong was genetic theory. He actually had a very advanced and very intricate genetic theory, and it was completely wrong. So sometimes when we do reason without observation, we do come to the wrong conclusion. It might be that our mechanism has the right structure, but the details of that mechanism, so for example the branches in the tree, those details might be wrong. So according to your reading, and this is I think a very interesting move, there's no clear distinction between well-reasoned, well-supported, well-justified beliefs and facts. Now I want you to understand that this shifts the special attention away from facts. Facts are not just things that we have in the world. Facts are things that we reason to within our worldview according to the reading. So I want you to notice the emphasis on careful perspective. If we've done good enough work, whatever that means, then what we've discovered, what we've reasoned to, is a fact. And this is where it's important to choose your theory of truth. Do you have to have some sort of correspondence here in order to have good support and justification, or do you have to have merely some sort of coherence? So now we've understood what facts are. So facts need not be derived from observation. We can just reason to facts. They can be wrong, even if they are assumptions, and they are reducible to justified beliefs. So it might be upon further exploration we have to question these facts about facts, which makes it very interesting. Because what we're doing is reasoning to arrive at factual information about what factual information is in itself. So now let's turn to evidence. And we're going to talk about the starting steps for evaluating evidence. And we can talk about confirmation and disconfirmation just a bit. So confirmation is very simple. If a theory makes a prediction and that prediction is realized, then we conclude that there is evidence that the theory adequately fits the world or the phenomenon. So here's a very simple example. If we take the following structure, if T, so if some sort of theory, then an observation, and we observe O, then we conclude that probably T. Now you might recall a very similar structure that's slightly different from symbolic logic. If T, then O, T, and therefore O, would be the structure of modus ponens. But in this case, what we have is affirming the consequent, which is not good reasoning. That is not a valid argument structure. But this is why we have probably, the term probably in here, because this is an inductive argument. We have some sort of evidence that the theory adequately fits the world, but it does not follow that the theory does fit the world. So we have a very weak notion, an inductive notion of confirmation. Now disconfirmation can be deductive, which is very fascinating. So check this out. Theory makes a prediction that's not realized, and we conclude that the theory is wrong. So here's the structure. If T, then O, not O, therefore not T. So this is the direct structure of modus tollens. And in this case, we have a valid argument structure. This follows deductively that the theory is wrong. Now here is a very simple example, and we briefly mentioned Lamarck. So if you all remember, Lamarck is the guy who was pre-Darwin, and he thought that if a giraffe stretches its neck towards leaves, then that trait will be passed on to future generations. He was completely wrong. We think he's very silly nowadays, and this is how it looks. Here's how we can disconfirm Lamarck's theory of evolution. If Lamarck's theory of evolution is correct, then acquired neck stretching is heritable into the next generation. In fact, it's not. So if we observe giraffes stretching their necks to gain leaves, and we observe some sort of physiological change in musculature from that stretching, what we see is those effects are not heritable into the next generation. And this is the brilliance of Darwin's distinction between acquired and inherited traits. So we conclude that his theory is incorrect. And this seems completely on board with something that we've thought for hundreds of years. Now, I want you to understand that there's a different interpretation of what disconfirmation reasoning is all about, and this interpretation is inductive. And I want you to see the subtle shift. Theory makes a prediction that's not realized, and we conclude not that the theory is wrong, but that there is no evidence that the theory adequately fits the world. Now notice it, that there is no evidence. And I want you to think about how intuitive this move is for us. So for example, if we say something like the following: I've never seen a Sasquatch in my life, and therefore there are no Sasquatches. That might be a good conclusion for other reasons, but in terms of observation, that wouldn't be good method. Why? Because perhaps we haven't made enough observations. So if we continue to make more observations, perhaps we will gain the evidence, but so far we have no evidence that there are Sasquatches. So the structure here is the following. If T, then O, not O, and therefore we have no evidence that T. So we don't say T is false, we just say we currently have no evidence that T. So here's how we can put this into application by using the Lamarckian evolution example. If Lamarck's theory of evolution is correct, then acquired neck stretching is heritable into the next generation. We have the same conditional statement. It's not, and therefore there is no evidence for his theory. Now, here's where it gets really cool. What if we do the following? So think about it this way. Maybe giraffes stretching their necks, that acquired trait, is not heritable into the next generation, but perhaps some sort of acquired traits are heritable into the next generation. So why don't we take a look at other organisms, other traits? What if we take a different trait in a different organism, thereby shifting our measurement setup? Then perhaps we might discover some sort of evidence in confirmation. So a really cool example is that a fungicide called vinclozolin is actually something that has changed the mating behavior in rat populations. So rats do a little bit of a mating dance. This is something that has actually changed, and the inheritance of this mating dance has changed even when the vinclozolin is out of the picture. And this is very similar to our example of developing fish embryos. If there are predators around and those predators release certain pheromones, then what ends up happening is fish have a developmental response, and that developmental response is actually heritable into the next generation. So the punchline is, perhaps we're just taking a look at a different kind of measurement setup. Perhaps we need to expand the scope of our measurements, or just look at a different organism altogether. So here's the note about disconfirmation. We may miss the phenomenon because the measurement setup is one way, and as soon as we shift it to be another way, we can see the phenomenon and get the proper confirmation. So I think for this reason, the inductive version of disconfirmation is more adequate to scientific practice. All we need to do is shift the measurement setup, and then we can see that there's some sort of confirmation, or perhaps we just get no evidence after we shift the measurement setup. And if we keep on shifting the measurement setup, we still have no evidence. So the strongest conclusion that we make is we have no evidence that a theory is true, rather than this theory is false. So let's summarize confirmation and disconfirmation. Observation and prediction are used to evaluate theory. If the predicted observation occurs, theory is supported. If the predicted observation does not occur, theory is either not supported, this is the inductive notion, or the theory is rejected, so it's shown to be false. This is the deductive version. I think the inductive version is much more adequate to scientific practice. What I'd like to do in our next module is try to apply some of this. So in the history of philosophy of science, confirmation and disconfirmation is something that is very abstract, and we can see how it works structurally. But how do we actually apply this? How is it that we can pick out certain observations that support a theory? And how can we use observation to differentiate two theories that are very similar in many respects? This is what we will turn to next week, and you will have a very interesting case study to read. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.